Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Education Corner podcast are thrilled to welcome Lara Choksey, who joined UCL as a lecturer in the English department in 2021. In the same year, she published her book, Narrative in the Age of Genome, Genetic Worlds, which explores the ways in which descriptions of biological value introduce themselves through practices of genomic sequencing from the late 1970s, registered as a broader crisis of narrative form. Lara has studied all across the UK, achieving her BA in English at the University of Leeds in 2010, followed by an MA Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths College London and PhD in English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. In between her MA and PhD, she worked as a city reporter for the Statesman's newspaper in Kolkata, India. She has been a visiting scholar at the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University and has held postdoctoral research fellowships at Warwick's Institute for Advanced Study between 2017 and 2018, and the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health at the University of Exeter in 2018 to 21. She has been affiliated with the UCL Sarah Parker Remond Centre as a visiting research fellow since October 2020, where she is now faculty associate. She joined UCL as a lecturer, as I said, in 2021. It's a real pleasure to have you with us, Lara. Would you like to tell us a little bit more? I mean, we've obviously done the introduction about who you are and the work that you do.
Hello, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here. So as you said, my first degree was in English at Leeds, and that's where I did my first ever module on postcolonial literature in my third year. But I was also reading a lot of critical theory and American literature. So I think that was really important for thinking about not just the post-colonial, but the global, and these systems that we talk about in the module that we're going to talk about in a little bit, thinking about them in much broader context. And then I sort of shifted sideways and I did this master's in cultural studies at Goldsmiths. And that was a bit of a departure from just literature. And again, it was such an important year for learning more about these bigger systems and reading lots of continental philosophy as well, which I really felt I was very much in the deep end. Actually, funnily enough, last week I was in Berlin and someone who I did the master's with was there at the conference and we were catching up, and it just brought back all of these memories of feeling completely out of my depth because there were these brilliant German MA students who had read loads of Hegel and Kant and Marx, and I really felt I had to catch up when I started my PhD. But in between the MA and the PhD, I took a break from academia and I sort of fell into journalism when I went to live in Calcutta, which is where my dad's side of the family is from. And I became a city reporter for the Statesman newspaper. And they were a brilliant paper to work for because there really wasn't an editorial policy, in the sense that I didn't have someone breathing down my neck saying, this is how you have to write this particular story. I was very much given carte blanche to go out and do the stories that were interesting and that I wanted to work on. And I ended up doing lots of stuff about urban development and about evictions of lots of people, mainly daily wage workers, and a lot of stories on public health as well. So I was covering all of these different aspects, I suppose, of human experience, but also coming up to the limits of my own knowledge as well. And that was when I decided to do a PhD and to think more carefully about the relationship between the communication of science in public and what literature has to do with that. So I did a project for my PhD on Doris Lessing's science fiction novels. And these are 5 novels that are all about colonialism and development, and also about evolution and eugenics. And then that project became a bigger book, Narrative in the Age of the Genome. I actually wanted to publish the Doris Lessing book as a book on its own, but my examiner sort of waiting for that moment in the PhD Viva. There's supposed to be a moment where they say, so let's discuss your plans for publication. And I sort of had to prompt them and I said, so can I publish this as a book? And they said, well, we think that a Doris Lessing monograph isn't really going to sell, so you should do this as a bigger book and use different examples, use lots of different examples, which I think is a little unfair on Doris Lessing. But I think they were right. That turned into Narrative in the Age of the Genome, which is about the politics of genomic science and how literature played a part in communicating that revolution in the life sciences in the 1990s, but also resisting and anticipating some of its conclusions and some of its more sinister implications.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. You're the course governor for the UCL English Department's new module on colonial and postcolonial literature, which is obviously very exciting. And I know that lots of people sign up for it at the moment each year. How did this idea come about, and what do you hope for students to take away from studying colonial and postcolonial literature?
So the idea for that course had been around for a few years, and the question was always how it was going to fit into the department's existing format for options courses, which are generally team taught, and they're usually based on a period or a place. And the discussion around that course really started at the point of interview. And what I was really excited about was that because of the way that courses run in English at UCL, we could go back to the Renaissance and then up to the contemporaries. So the aim in designing this course was to really emphasize the long historical range. So historically, technically, colonial and postcolonial literatures starts in 1492 with Columbus landing in Guanahani and ends in 2020 with Black Lives Matter and some of the contemporary work around post-colonial eco-criticism. And that structure meant that a lot of staff in the department could be involved in it, which is one of the things that excited me most back in those early days when we were first talking about it, when I started the job. So the set texts reflect departmental expertise in the Renaissance. We start with John Fletcher's The Island Princess. We go to American literature. We do the history of Mary Prince. And then we go to modernism with Conrad and the poetry of Claude Mackay. And then there is some more familiar post-colonial texts in the latter half of the term. So Baptiste Sautoir, and we end with Steve McQueen's Mangrove film. That was very exciting to feel that we could end with that and to end with film. And then the second term lectures begin again with the early modern period with a lecture on Leo Africanus, the Moroccan diplomat. And then we move through Romanticism and Empire, Modernism, post-colonial film and eco-criticism. And that recursive structure I felt was really important to keep the course feeling active and to really keep a hyphen between the colonial and the post-colonial. So what I wanted to avoid was a kind of chronological move where we start in big bag colonial period and then we end with resistance and decolonization and liberation, partly because there was resistance from day one. As soon as colonial activities are happening, there is resistance to them. So I wanted to avoid that sort of chronological narrative. And then also, obviously, to think about how we are still not post-colonial, despite the incredibly important, enormous seismic shifts of the mid-20th century. There are lots of ways in which the global order continues to be organized by colonial infrastructure. And then in response to that second question, what were we hoping that students would take away from studying colonial and post-colonial literature? So I wanted to talk about a really wonderful book by someone called Ashley Cohen called The Global Indies. And in that, she talks about the imaginative geography of British imperialism. And this was a really important idea for this course, to convey a sense of the imaginative geography. What does that mean? So she uses literature at the beginning of this book to tell a different story about 18th century England and how they understood these places that were now emerging through print, through stories coming back to the UK. She starts by talking about the poet William Cowper's long poem, The Winter Evening, from his poem, The Task. And this poem starts with someone sitting in a countryside inn and they're sitting by the fire and it's icy outside and the speaker hears someone twanging a horn in the distance. And this is someone delivering newspapers. It's the herald of a noisy world. His boots are muddy and he's got news from all nations lumbering on his back. So he's carrying a bunch of newspapers and he dumps these papers at the inn and then he goes off again into the night. And so this is a really chaotic interruption of this quite idyllic, icy scene in winter. And there's a connection between this careless figure and the noisy world that he's delivering through print. And he is connected to the inn by this system of exchange. So the inn is a commercial enterprise buying newspapers for its clientele to read. This example really gets at how a system is emerging and how that system arrives if you like, in these local contexts. So it's a really mundane place to tell a story about this rapidly globalizing world. So that felt like a very exciting place to start. This idea of an imaginative geography that is in the process of being formed and coming into being, if you like, through literary endeavors, through the ways that people are writing about this in literature. There's a very famous French historian called Fernand Braudel, who approached history as a kind of longue durée, and he was also a really important influence on thinking about how this course was going to come into being. And there were just two other things that I wanted to mention, and I know that you're going to ask me a question about language later on. So one thing that we could do in this course by sticking, one of the constraints is by more or less stick to European languages. And that's partly because of our own expertise and lack of expertise as a department in non-European languages. So one of the things that we could do with that constraint is to talk about creolization, which is a term from the Bayesian poet Kamal Brathwaite. And this is also a way of avoiding more sort of anthropological approaches where one author is taken to represent the whole of a national literature. This has sort of famously been the case for Chinua Achebe, and this was something that Achebe tried to resist by setting up the African Writers series. So something that we could talk about was the creolization of language and what Brathwaite calls the submersion of West African languages within English. And that feels like a really exciting place to start as well. So again, you're not just talking about the straightforward imposition of a language in colonized spaces, although that is absolutely happening as well. You're also talking about these really complicated forms of exchange, cultural exchange, linguistic exchange, and all of the power dynamics that are involved in those exchanges as well. So that was also something that felt possible to talk about in this course and starting from such an early point. And then the other thing that a literature course can ask is, where is the social and the cultural in and amidst the political and the economic? And so one of the big questions that literary studies after a certain point in the 20th century gets from psychoanalysis is, where does desire go? How does desire emerge in and through these encounters, these power relations? And literature is a really important place for even beginning to start asking that question. And Sylvia Wynter and Frantz Fanon asked this question as well. These are two very important decolonial thinkers. In decolonial narratives, where's the mystery for the colonized subject when the environment is whiteness? And how can the human be narrated differently? So those are some of the things that we wanted to get at with the course.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. Is there such a thing as post-colonial literature?
It's such a difficult question. It's also a huge bone of contention within post-colonial criticism. I remember thinking about it a lot when I was an undergraduate and I was doing my course on post-colonial literature. What does that post mean? It suggests an after, doesn't it? After decolonization. But I think what the term post-colonial did in the 1980s was to allow a set of critical approaches to take up space within the academy. So it had a really sort of practical function in this sense. But at the same time, some of its key theorists sort of immediately distanced themselves from it as a term. So then you get the emergence of comparative literature, world literature. So yeah, there are lots of debates around the word. My thought is that it's still a useful term because it allows us to name the massive transformation of the global literary scene after the national revolutions of the mid-20th century. And it's really important for thinking about that process of who and what gets published, how that's happening. So I've already mentioned the Heinemann African Writers series and the work that Achebe did to get literature from across the African continent translated and published into English. And this was a really extraordinary moment. So post-colonial, I think, holds some of that energy. But I also wonder what's helpful for us now amidst the very much revitalizing important conversations and debates around decolonizing the curriculum. And I think what might be helpful is to put a hyphen again, to keep that hyphen between colonial and post-colonial. So colonial hyphen post-colonial. Keep that kind of as a helpful problematic, and to be working with the ambivalence of that post as a starting place. So how do these power relations show up in the present, interpersonally, transnationally? How does the history of colonialism continue to shape attitudes and beliefs in the present? That seems to me the kind of important thing. That's why I think people want to do the course, because they're coming up against these questions in their own experience of the world. And so one of the questions that came up through this course in seminars and in lectures is there any Anglophone literature after the 16th century that isn't in some way related to British colonialism, that doesn't relate in some way to the transformation of the world through these new routes over land and sea, and the technologies that have to be invented to make this possible, the explosion of print culture and the globalization of colonial languages. Edouard Glissant, the Martinican thinker, calls this, the metropolitan languages are like vehicular languages. They're like these vehicles that are being deposited into colonized spaces. So it's not easy to opt out, I think, of these seismic shifts, even if a text isn't taking colonialism or liberation as its theme, even if it isn't dealing with explicitly Black or brown characters or power dynamics between the colonized and the colonizer. Imperial conquest becomes an environment for literary writing. That's one way of thinking about it. And sometimes that's explicitly, as in Mansfield Park and Jane Eyre, but sometimes it's much less obviously. So thinking with the world system means that the range of ways to approach these texts becomes much bigger. And I suppose one of the things that we can do under that banner of the post-colonial is also to estrange familiar works of literature. And that's been sort of, I suppose, one of the tactics of post-colonial criticism. So I don't have a final answer on whether or not we should continue to use post-colonial, but I think it still continues to be useful.
Do you have thoughts on the emergence of AI, obviously artificial intelligence, and its relationship with colonialism?
This is such a fascinating question, and I find the phrasing of this really interesting. There's a sociologist called Ruha Benjamin who wrote a book called Race After Technology, and she makes this very simple argument that humans create algorithms and humans have deeply entrenched biases. So the idea that algorithms are unbiased, so technological subjects can be neutral where humans can't, that idea doesn't account for how algorithms will just reproduce and amplify existing prejudices. So big data, which is part of what AI runs on, its fuel, can function as a kind of positive feedback loop, data reinforcing new data. And what happens with positive feedback loops is that they run into chaos, they run into disequilibrium, they run into crisis. So I suppose my sort of idealistic response is that language needs to grow and change. One of the ways it does that is through error, through making mistakes, and you need to know what a mistake is. So a big sort of pro argument for AI is accessibility, and I think this is a really difficult one to argue with, because in lots of ways it does have the potential to really democratize learning. I suppose my question is, what is it that's being accessed? Is it just pure information? Can AI tell you what to do with this information, how to work with it, how to curate it? And I suppose what worries me, and where that colonial question is very interesting, is that it's not always obvious how AI is working, how it's getting to its conclusions. So it goes back to what I was saying about submergence. Language doesn't operate transparently. That's one of the most joyful things about this job, is you're looking at a poem or you're looking at a piece of literature and you realize how opaque not only the piece of literature that you're looking at is, but also, therefore, by extension, the world is around you. So at its most exciting, language is packed full of compounds and puns and misdirection. So I suppose a counter response would be to say, okay, but AI can learn how to make a joke. But I don't think the question is whether or not ChatGPT can make a joke. It's about the joy of making a joke and the horror of it falling flat. You learn something about language and rhythm and pacing when you take those kinds of risks. So you're out on the ledge, however that might manifest, you're out there without a rope. What's going to happen? So that's not just information, that's a whole set of responses going around your body and between you and others. So I suppose in terms of thinking about not just whether or not a form is colonial, but also how we can decolonize and how we can think about other ways of thinking, part of that involves risk-taking. Part of that involves thinking about not only my own position, but also my position in relation to sets of other people, my encounters with them. These are all difficult things, I think, to talk about and to think about and to negotiate in a seminar room or outside of it. I suppose that's another response to not necessarily whether AI is colonial, but whether it can be used as a tool to help us unlearn colonial habits of thought. And I suppose just one other thing that I find interesting about the idea that there's a link between AI and colonialism is that it gets, I think, what we might call the anxiety of globalization, that English is its own kind of positive feedback loop, and that the work of translation is just information passing through other words. So I think there is a real anxiety around AI, partly because of this. It's that kind of idea that we can reduce all of our experience to just sort of segments of information.
We've attended a lot of lectures, and I think that taking workload off teachers, and there's all sorts of different aspects, and obviously the social mobility aspect is definitely something that everyone's discussing. But I think one thing that none of us can get away from, and I think COVID probably taught everyone this, is human interaction. It's something that you can't teach. So
and it's really hard to get right.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we never get it right, but we try.
Exactly. Yeah. How can we construct a new canon out of these works? In many cases, the postcolonial canon is still defined by the old imperial centre, and this problem can be seen to impact the way such literature is taught in academic institutions in the UK, for example. To what extent do you feel that this has affected the discourse or changed it, and how can we challenge this?
This is such a great question. It's such an important question. I also come at this through biology, strangely, because a lot of the questions that I try and tackle in biology, as in the kind of preservation of particular genetic lineages, tie into this question of canon formation and a national canon in which these are the top authors. This is something actually that Sylvia Winter tackles in an essay called Black Studies Manifesto, and she takes apart a critic called Harold Bloom, who'd written his own canon, and there are no Black authors on this canon. And he got a lot of criticism for this at the time. And she was one of the people who brought this up. And she linked this to what she called a biocentric descriptive statement of man, where we think of ourselves, or humans are thought of as being a sort of expression of a genealogical line. So I see the canon as being part of that biological thinking, if you like, or evolutionary thinking. It would be another way of saying it. And it is a problem, I think, that we have to negotiate. And I think it has to always be negotiated collectively. So, of course, like this one can always ask, what is happening now? And I'm really aware when I'm teaching, I can't get away with fatalism in the last lecture of a course. So one of the questions that we ended with was, how then shall we succeed? And that's a quote from Brathwaite. How then shall we succeed? What happens now? How can poetics and poetry imagine new modes of habitation, not only in terms of the way that we live, but also in stories that we tell in order to survive, I suppose, and survive with others? And I wanted to talk about an essay by an American poet called June Jordan called Beyond Apocalypse Now, which was sent to me by a colleague a few months ago. And as you might know, Apocalypse Now is an adaptation of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is one of our texts that we read on this course, set in the Vietnam War. So June Jordan's a Black American poet, and she's talking in this essay about being in a place called St. Paul in Minnesota, and she feels herself to be very far away from home. And I don't know whether she turns on the TV because she's in this hotel room and she doesn't know what else to do. So she turns on the TV and Apocalypse Now is playing, but she starts talking about Apocalypse Now. And she says, on the surface of it, it presents itself as being a film about Vietnam, but really it's about American atrocities. And really it's about the survival of these two white men. So it's a kind of rewriting of Chinua Achebe's essay on Heart of Darkness, where he says similar things. She does this really interesting thing because she actually helped me to understand Conrad better. And Conrad is obviously an extremely canonical writer. She said, as I sit inside this living room, a Black poet in the heart of white America, what should I do? I suppose I could run out and kill someone just to show I'm only human and rather far away from home. And it made me think about Heart of Darkness in a completely different way. It made me think that actually maybe what Conrad wants us to know, what Conrad implies in Heart of Darkness, this deeply difficult text, racist text, is that equality between humans would be something to do with a shared failure to deal with homesickness. And that literature becomes a way to explore the alienation that's packed into the articulation of nostos. And killing is the only way back to being human. I suppose I could run out and kill somebody, some savage passerby, just to show I'm only human and rather far away from home. So this is not an EDI or an equality of we're all human and we all need to get along with each other and we're all capable of empathy. This is a really, I suppose, dark way of understanding a shared experience, which is being far away from home. But I suppose the challenge that Jordan is throwing up to the reader is that it does not have to be this way. We do not have to interact with the world in this way. This is not the only way to deal with homesickness. And that also to me feels like a way of talking about canon formation, because what happens when we're deciding what stays and what is included and what's excluded is in its strange way its own form of sort of social murder. It sounds very extreme. I suppose there are sort of three big other thinkers that I think about when I think about this question and this crossover between evolutionary thinking and canon formation. One of them is the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. The other one is Sylvia Wynter. And the other one is a geographer and sociologist called Abdulmalik Simone. And all of them are thinking about configurations of human life and how these configurations are first and foremost imaginative, and how we imagine ourselves and our communities and the life worlds we inhabit. The relations between us and other living beings can and do shape the way that we live in the world. And so what they all suggest in their different ways is that how can we move from a biocentric description of human to thinking about humans as storytellers? And that seems really critical if we're thinking about the future of culture, the future of the canon, the future of how we interact with each other.
So in 2021, you published the book Narrative in the Age of Genome, Genetic Wilds. It's published by Bloomsbury. It was shortlisted for the 2021 BSLS Book Prize. Do you want to just quickly tell us a little bit more about this book? Then I think we began talking about it at the start, but it's obviously fantastic that you've published recently.
Yeah, thanks. So the book is about the way that genomics is represented in literature and also in film. It talks about the film Gattaca and the way that some of the key figures of the Human Genome Project also use literary techniques and genres to communicate the science. So there's a chapter on memoirs of the Human Genome Project, which goes into some of the metaphors that some of the scientists were using to communicate genomics to a non-scientific wider public. I think for me, the big question of the book was what the idea of the human becomes after the sequencing of the human genome, and the way that that massive science project unsettled the stability of that species category, Homo sapiens, and what we do now with that, whether it's still useful to us to think about humans in an age of climate catastrophe. And this seems to be a moment when the ecological violence of colonial capitalism is under such a great amount of scrutiny. So I end with a chapter on toxic infrastructure, but it's meant to be a happy ending. One of the things that I say is that the post-genomic is a chance to rethink the category of human and our relations to non-human and non-living entities and creatures. And I don't quite give up on the concept of human. I'm more with Sylvia Wynter. I think that we can re-enchant humanism for the future. So that's where it ends.
And are there any plans for more books?
Many, many plans. Yes. So I'm, like many people, moving much more towards some of the bigger ecological questions that are in the mix now, and thinking about environments and surroundings and how they might be animated differently.
Very exciting. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Lara, and I sincerely wish you the best of luck with all your investigations and book writing and obviously running the course at UCL. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been wonderful talking to you.